Welcome back to Tech Coach Corner, presented by Dyknow. I'm Sierra Lustig, your host, and today I'm joined once again by Dr. Sean Coffron from Manassas City Public Schools, and we're talking all about social emotional learning, the evolution of social emotional learning, and how digital citizenship is beginning to play a huge role in SEL during this time of remote learning. It's a great conversation, lots of actionable tips and takeaways, so excited for you all to learn from Sean. Before we jump in, once again, just want to remind everyone to subscribe to Dyknow's YouTube channel. We have a giveaway going on through Friday, so today is your last chance to enter. Go ahead and enter that, and don't forget to follow us on all of our social media. We're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, so we can't wait for you all to engage with us there. I think that's all I have to plug today, so let's jump into our conversation with Sean. Coach Corner, everyone. I'm Sierra Lustig, your host, and today I'm joined by Dr. Sean Coffron. Sean, would you mind giving a brief introduction to yourself before we jump in?
Sure. I teach in Virginia, in Manassas City. That's just outside of DC. I've been teaching there for 20 years, and I've served as a classroom teacher. I've served as an intervention specialist and administrator, and recently I've been serving as a technology coach at our middle school.
Great. Well, we are excited to have you back on Tech Coach Corner. We've worked with you a lot before on the Tackling Tech podcast, as well as our remote learning summit. So I'm really excited to have you back. Today, we're going to be talking about social emotional learning. This topic has kind of come to light more recently for me personally. So I would love to get your take on what social emotional learning means, how it can be prioritized at the school and the district level, and then what are some strategies that you've found are effective to promote social emotional learning, both in the classroom and during this kind of uncharacteristic time of remote learning.
Right. So as teachers, we find ourselves with two roles in the classroom. Of course, we have multiple hats, but I find that the two primary roles are we serve as an imparter of knowledge and an educator and someone who helps with learning. And we also find ourselves as someone who is supporting the students and helping them to grow as people. And I think the most important thing in both of those roles is to help the students prepare to learn, help the students to come to the learning environment and be prepared to accept this knowledge or understand the information that we're delivering to them, whether it be how to grow as a person or how to grow as a learner or to impart that content knowledge. And I think most importantly, especially if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the students' basic needs must be met if they are prepared to learn, or if they're prepared to learn and grow. And I think that's where socio-emotional learning really comes into play. It started out really more talking about, how to make sure the student feels comfortable and creating a learning environment. And then at the turn of the century, we really took more of a focus away from the classroom and the teacher's role and focusing more on the teacher as a facilitator of student growth. And then as we learned more about RTI and PBIS, positive behavior through intervention and supports, it became increasingly apparent that in order for students to really understand how they feel, to be empathetic to their own needs and to the needs of others, they really have to have a structure in place where we are helping them to go through those conversations. Not that we're teaching students how to feel or we're teaching students how to get in touch with their emotions. More so, we are helping them to facilitate that growth within themselves. And by that, what I mean is providing different opportunities for students to explore different emotional settings or different scenarios where they will be asked to be making judgment calls or decisions that really foster that mindfulness, that understanding of how students feel in certain scenarios and how they can be, for example, better allies of their peers in bullying, or how they can be more mindful of things that stress them out and how they can be better caretakers of their own person. One of the things I think is important with socio-emotional learning is to incorporate it into the general curriculum. For example, like digital citizenship or like character counts. Some of us may remember that from 10 or 15 years ago, and I know they still have some pretty strong content now. It's very difficult to teach that in isolation. It's very difficult to say, okay, today we're going to have our character lesson. It feels very contrived, in my opinion, and it also does very little for the student because they're not able to incorporate those vocabulary words or those character lessons into a more relevant context. So for example, we may talk to students about what it means to be a good citizen and give them different attributes and different tasks that can show that they're a good citizen. But then that does very little for them in the real world, where citizenship in itself is not a means to an end. It's an abstract concept that we use to describe how we should treat one another and how we should be better caretakers of our society. So I think it's important with socio-emotional learning that we take that next step, that we focus on the student's experience and making sure that our lessons are relevant to the student and also within a context that makes sense within the classroom and the school culture at large. The interesting thing is with the advent of PBIS, it provides an excellent way for us to show students and promote positive behaviors that would normally be in an SEL lesson. So by showing students how to grow socio-emotionally within the context of the school community, PBIS provides that token economy or that structure for rewarding positive behaviors and also giving students an opportunity to reflect on behaviors that were more destructive or decisions that may not have been the best decision at the time. As a school, I know that as a school division, we are a strong proponent of restorative justice and PBIS as a preventative measure to help students to focus on the learning experience of the decisions they make rather than being more punitive. And I know that like other schools in Virginia, we've done a lot to provide those structures. I know the Commonwealth has done a lot to provide direction about what PBIS is and how PBIS should be an important part of our disciplinary practices. And I think Manassas has done a very good job of this. One of the things that we focus on is communicating clear expectations and communicating them in indirect manners. So for example, we'll have signage that's put up throughout the building, or we'll have routines that are built into our classroom practice where students are reminded that this is the way to behave, this is the way to speak, this is the way to have an effective classroom discussion. And in that way, we can indirectly promote positive behavior without cramming a bunch of rules down their throats and constantly saying, don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other thing. Rather, it becomes a larger part of our discussion and a larger part of the instructional piece of our learning. One of the strategies that we're using here in remote learning is to continue that vein of focusing on the instructional piece of character development. So for example, we use many common sense media resources at commonsensemedia.org regarding digital citizenship. And what's interesting is in the remote learning environment, they have provided something called Wide Open Schools, where it really focuses on digital citizenship in a remote learning setting. And ironically, that becomes our new form of character education or our new form of socio-emotional learning because our platform is 100% virtual at this time. If it becomes a more hybrid model, we might find ourselves going back to some of the practices that we've used in previous years. But the nice thing about this remote learning is that we really can take a more focused look at digital citizenship and what it means to be a member of the digital community. Some of the strategies that we're using badges to reward students. We are rewarding students by giving them visual or auditory cues that they're doing the right thing. And that can be as simple as saying, you know, Sean, I really liked how you did that kind of immediate positive feedback. If someone is showing a pattern of positive behavior, we might send them a note, or we might contact their parents and say, hey, you're doing a great job. I wanted to give you some feedback that these were specific times that your son or daughter really demonstrated positive behavior in the learning environment. I know that remote learning can be difficult, but she or he is doing a great job. I think that kind of positive reinforcement continues to be an important strategy that we can use. Similarly, if there are preferred activity times or preferred activities that are available to students in the remote learning environment, perhaps these socio-emotional learning exercises can be gateways to those activities, or exhibiting those positive behaviors can become a means to an end for some students who are still in the learning process and they haven't developed that intrinsic motivation. Similarly, if someone is having difficulty with the remote learning environment or needs a little extra support in learning how to act or how to care for one another, there are specific interventions that can be put into place, such as the use of a breakout room where you can take a student and move them into a breakout room where they're in an environment where it's just that student and the teacher. And then you can have a more personal conversation about the motivations behind those behaviors and talk a little bit about, you know, what could be going on in that student's life. Similar to in a more traditional setting, having a student go out in the hall and having a conversation with them. And there are many other ways that we can redirect or represent more traditional strategies within a remote learning environment. But I think the most important strategy is to remain proactive in nature, to continue to state norms and expectations at the beginning of every remote learning session. It may feel a little redundant for us as instructors, but for the students, I think it becomes a very important part of the framing mechanism where they, similar to walking into a classroom, they enter a session and they go, okay, I understand the expectations and I'm going to adapt to meet those. Because the truth is that from one classroom to another, some students will find, and it's very apparent to them, that some teachers will allow certain behaviors and some teachers will not. So they need to have that opportunity to adjust in a remote learning environment, similar to what they would do in a brick and mortar classroom. And more to that point, I think another great strategy is to have consistent expectations. So to minimize that transition as much as possible. If the school or if a department can come to terms about specific strategies or specific routines that are going to be built into the classroom environment, or specific behaviors that are not going to be tolerated, that will make it easier for students because they have a more consistent vision of what it means to be an appropriate member of the remote learning environment. And then it will require less transition from one to another.
I love those strategies, and I think the positive reinforcement is so important. I also really love how you connected it to digital citizenship. I think a big similarity between digital citizenship and socio-emotional learning is that they are frameworks that should be taught in the classroom, but they're not solely only applicable to the classroom. They're things that students need throughout their whole lives, and they help them navigate the world, especially the technology world that we now live in. So I think that's a great comparison, that they should be taught, but not in maybe a lesson format. They're just baked into all of those lessons in the classroom. So thank you, Sean, for sharing that. We will put your contact information and your social information below so that people can engage with you if they'd like to learn more. But thank you so much for being with us today to talk about social emotional learning.
Anytime.